Hello, and welcome to the Break from the Bench series, hosted by the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges.
Robinson. I'm a senior program manager with the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. And I have the honor of having with me today the Honorable Jerry Bowles, who is retired from the Circuit Court of the Commonwealth of Kentucky and is currently a principal in the family law mediation firm of Bowles and Byer in Louisville, Kentucky. And Jennifer Rose, who is co-founder and co-director of Inspire Action for Social Change, which is a nonprofit organization working to create social change and violence against women and children. And she also provides training and technical assistance on those issues. I'm going to ask Judge Bowles and Jennifer to introduce themselves, to talk a little bit about their expertise around supervised visitation and exchange. So Judge Bowles.
Thank you, Michelle. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. I'm Judge Bowles. I served 20 years on the family court bench. Kentucky's family court judges are elected to family court. Prior to taking the family court bench, I worked 14 years as a prosecutor and the last 5 in the domestic violence and sexual assault unit that I initiated. So I've had lots of experience working with battered women, both prosecuting domestic violence criminal cases, but also in the divorce, custody, child abuse, neglect cases that came through, and the civil protection order cases. We had the fortune of having a supervised visitation center in Louisville for a number of years that was partially funded by the Violence Against Women's Office and utilized their protocols and their guiding principles. So familiar with the program, familiar with the process, and familiar with the cases.
Thank you. Jen.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jennifer Rose, as Michelle said, and I'm the co-founder of Inspire Action for Social Change. And we are also the targeted technical assistance provider for the Justice for Families grant for those grantees who have supervised visitation programs. I come to you having worked in the anti-violence field, for 28 years. Started as an advocate on a hotline, went to running a domestic violence program, at which time our court in Santa Cruz, California, came to me and said, hey, we really would like you to open a supervised visitation program. Ours has closed, and we think that you would be a good program to do that. And I remember thinking that seemed a little bit crazy. However, I like a good challenge. And they dangled this sort of new OVW funding to really look at this work specifically for working with families who've experienced intimate partner violence. And so we signed on and were part of the demonstration initiative that really launched what was formerly the Safe Havens grant program. And we were part of the California demonstration site where we had just the privilege and opportunity to spend 5 years really looking at unpacking, listening to folks around the country, listening to our community, survivors, people who caused harm, judges, attorneys, domestic violence partners, to really learn how to move this field forward. And this service in particular in a way that centered the safety of adult survivors and children, while also offering opportunities for healing and change for families coming through our doors. And so since 2005, I've been providing technical assistance and training around supervised visitation and safe exchange to folks around the country, and just feel that it is one of the most important resources our communities have to support the safety and create opportunities for change for families impacted by intimate partner violence. And just feel passionate and excited to keep having this conversation, to keep growing the field, to be able to keep learning from folks who are doing the work and creating safety and building this into the larger community response, which in some communities it just hasn't been a part of. So glad to be here today and look forward to talking with my friend, Judge Bowles.
Thank you so much. Jennifer, could you adjust your mic because it's a little bit difficult to hear you? So if you would adjust your mic for us, that would be great. Thank you. So again, thank you all for joining us. This is going to be very conversational. It's three old friends kind of sitting and chatting and talking about court and supervised visitation and exchange. Please feel free to, if you have questions that might arise during our conversation, or if you have follow-up questions, please feel free to post those in the chat. We will try to get to those, but if not, we will reach out via email to address your questions. So thank you all again for joining us, and we will jump right in. So Jen, what do you see as the biggest challenge judges and supervised visitation centers face in cases involving custody and visitation? And then Jen, after you respond with the supervised visitation view of things, I'd like to ask Judge Bowles to then respond around the court view of things.
So I think one of the biggest challenges we face as supervised visitation providers and the courts is the limited resources in our communities that are doing change work, in particular with people who've caused violence. I think that what happens in many communities is a supervised visitation program is one of the few programs who's working simultaneously with parents and children, and working simultaneously with parents who've used violence, survivors of violence, and children. And while the role of visitation, and I know you've heard me say this some, I think there are opportunities for change. The service itself, the role of visitation program is not to change behavior. It's to provide a place where families can have contact that continues to be safe. And what happens in many communities in a challenge, and I'd say it's both for the courts and visitation programs, is that without, I saw someone still struggling. Michelle, can you hear me better now?
Yes, we can hear you better. Thank you.
Is that without another resource, without a resource that is doing some sort of change work or therapeutic work, in particular with people who use violence in a community where supervised visitation is being offered to a family, often the courts rely on what they can learn from a visitation program to make the very hard decisions they have to make, and the orders they have to make for families to move forward, potentially outside of supervised visitation. And so without an intermediary, without other resources and places where parents can be sent to get the help that visitation programs don't provide, I think visitation programs and courts are in a tough position where the information is not, visitation doesn't have the information a judge needs to change a visitation order from visitation to unsupervised or exchange, because the role of a visitation program isn't to change behavior of those who cause harm. And so I think the biggest challenge we have is the lack of resources and community interveners working collaboratively to do the change work, so that while supervised visitation programs are providing safe supervised visits, other folks are doing the work of creating change to give the information to the courts they need to know whether a person is safe or continues to be unsafe to have unsupervised access. So I think that's like one of our biggest challenges as partners, as a community, around finding ways to support families well in supervised visits to get the help they need to change their behavior.
Thank you, Jen. Judge Bowles, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that as judges, we have a lot of challenges that focus just around domestic violence cases in general. I think one of the biggest challenges is trying to put families into the adversarial process, into the court process. And so we've developed specialty courts like family courts, domestic violence courts, recognizing that these specialty courts really have to provide and deliver due process and comply with the components of the court system and laws, but also to try to be there to provide some resource and help to families. And so I think that that's our first hurdle, is recognizing the difference between a traditional adversarial court and specialty courts. I think the other challenge that we as judges have is that we don't have always the level of expertise, especially as new judges come onto the bench, that we would like to have regarding the field of domestic violence. Domestic violence is such a complex issue because of the intimate partner relationship coupled with the dangerousness, the risk, and the harm. So I think knowing that the resources are out there for a supervised visitation center and the expertise that they offer, and having to use the adversarial system makes it difficult to get the information that we would like to get from them. And so I think that's one of the challenges that we found in our community, was to develop the protocols so that the information that we needed to keep victims and children safe were in place when people needed to have access to the courts. I also think that one of the challenges for judges is understanding not only the benefits that the visitation center can offer and the need for it, and trying to triage the cases, because there are limited resources that are the most at risk, so that those cases have access to your visitation centers, but also recognizing the limitations. Some judges think once they get a family into a supervised visitation center, that becomes an evaluative process for when it's safe for that parent to have unsupervised parenting time. And so it can work both ways. Just because a parent who has proven to be a risk, safety risk for their partner or their children may be appropriate in the supervised visitation center, doesn't mean they're going to be appropriate outside of the supervised visitation center. It's kind of like the argument of, do we keep a protective order in place if it hasn't been violated? And we have to ask, is it not being violated because they respect the court order, and when it's gone, the person's no longer going to be safe? And so we kind of have that same quandary, that same assessment. And so not expecting the workers or the center to be an evaluation component for safety, but certainly to be alert if there are obvious safety issues that are occurring there. So it's like the inverse doesn't always prove what the outward conduct does. So those are some of the challenges that me and my colleagues recognized in utilizing as a supervised visitation center.
Thank you. Thank you both. So you both in your responses talked a little bit about partnership and communication. So what are some ways that courts can communicate and collaborate with supervised visitation centers? And by the same token, what are some ways that supervised visitation centers can communicate and collaborate with the courts?
Jen, why don't you take that first from the center's perspective, and then I'll kind of punt off of that with the court's perspective.
That sounds great. So, when we work with visitation programs, we encourage them from the very beginning to engage the courts in their, if we can, when they're first getting started, from the very development of their program, sitting down together, clarifying roles and expectations. Because I think sometimes, as we were just talking about challenges, sometimes it's the lack of understanding of the role and limitations of each of our partners that can cause some of the challenges and sometimes the issues within relationships and collaboration between partners and the courts and visitation in particular. And so really encouraging people to, from the beginning, lay that out as clearly as possible, understand hopes and expectations, and figure out together what is possible, and then also them being able to identify what's missing and how do we fill that gap. I think that in terms of communication and collaboration, we always encourage judges and visitation programs to visit one another, to come and see the context in which each other's doing their work so they have an understanding. So always asking visitation programs to invite their courts to come see the program, to see how it works, to know what it feels like, to have a clear visceral experience of visitation, so that when they're on the bench and when they're making orders and they're hearing people's stories, they have the whole picture of what can happen, of what safety looks like, and also the limitations that a visitation provider might offer. Really encouraging a plan for communication. Well, we recognize there can't be ex parte communication, and there's limits to how the courts can communicate with a visitation program around certain things. But figuring out how to come together big picture to talk about bigger issues, not individual families, but challenges, and rectify those collectively and together. And to figure out how can information be exchanged. We know this is one of the biggest challenges as well. Sometimes visitation programs have a lot of information that is helpful, but no way of relaying that information. And certainly we rely on our advocate partners and refer families to get the help they need, if they have an attorney, to get that information back to the court. But sometimes families don't have access to those resources, and there is information that gets lost or missed that could be really helpful. And so figuring out how when those problems emerge, how can there be a response that helps families in the best way possible without them having to jump through a bunch of hoops, or for information to just sit somewhere where it would actually be really helpful to support the safety of those adult survivors and children.
So
Jerry?
just to follow up, yeah, sure, Jen, just to follow up on Jen's comments, absolutely necessary that you have protocols and policies in place for the courts on how information can flow from the visitation center. When the court appoints, or when the court orders that parties participate with a local supervised visitation center, that visitation center typically is not a party to the case. So it's not like they can file things in that case. So you've got to have a mechanism. And remember that a great number of domestic violence victims and their families are unrepresented in the system, especially on our civil protection order dockets. And so they don't always have attorneys that can file motions. And sometimes there's repercussions for them if they're the enforcement for the court's orders regarding the supervised visitation. So having protocols, having policies in place, and those typically come from having organizations within the courts and their resources. My jurisdiction has a domestic violence prevention coordinating council. And so the supervised visitation director is on that organization. That organization is chaired by a judge. Early in the domestic violence movement, when we were encouraging judges to have community-based and court-based organizations, collaborative efforts with the partners that the court used, there was some concern as to whether that was proper for judges to be engaged in that kind of a forum. And in fact, it is. Judges have been involved in crime commissions and murder task force and drug task force, and they can be involved in domestic violence task force as well. You're not biased if you're against domestic violence in the homes in your community, no more than you're biased if you're against drugs or homicides, as long as you're not discussing individual cases. And so we're talking about setting up protocols and practices on how that information can flow from that resource that you're using, that you're ordering. And also to look at your court personnel, and is there a way to use your court personnel as a liaison that prevents you from having ex parte contact or some kind of inappropriate biased contact in that case. We have court support workers in Louisville. Each judge has their own court support worker that acts as the liaison with drug abuse programs and parenting programs and supervised visitation exchange, and they can help direct parties without contact with the court. So look at how you have what resources you have within the personnel of the courts, and make sure they're trained, because those individuals need to understand the dynamics of domestic violence, the difficulties that victims have sometimes expressing their safety needs. They need to have training in assessing safety needs and doing safety plans. So the interaction between the agency and the courts is critical if you're going to use a supervised visitation plan effectively and for it to be a true safe resource for your community.
And
So-
to add to that,
I'm
can I add-
sorry.
yeah, no worries. I just want to add, a lot of communities are looking at a visitation liaison position, right? From a supervised visitation program that's in the courts more often, that's in the courtroom listening and meeting families, and helping really create a bridge, right? And then also building relationships, as you said, Jerry, with court personnel and others to sort of figure out collectively how to work together and bridge the gap between the two resources for families, and someone who's more knowledgeable and more connected and has those relationships that we're finding are really invaluable for building the communication and the trust and the collaboration between courts and visitation programs.
Thank you. Thank you both. So we know that you guys have named some challenges and that kind of thing. We know that cost can sometimes be a barrier. We know that availability or appropriate service providers can be a challenge. What are some ways that communities can look at overcoming those barriers? So barriers to centers who are trained, whose staff are trained around the dynamics of domestic violence and perpetrator behavior, or centers who might offer other types of visitation service, but not specifically domestic violence, supervised visitation or exchange, or centers that just aren't steeped in domestic violence and can therefore prove to be not as safe as some other alternatives. So what have you heard about creative ways that communities are addressing these barriers?
Jen, do you want to, because I probably don't have an answer for this one, Michelle. We've been fortunate, my community in Louisville has been fortunate enough to almost consistently have the resources of the Violence Against Women's Act through their Safe Havens grants and then the current grants that offer those resources. We have lost those resources in our community because we've lost the grant. And so our community did not pick up as we hoped they would, and we lobbied, but it's very difficult to get the community with all of the budget constraints that governments are currently under to recognize the benefit and the need for supervised visitation services. So I'd be anxious to hear from Jen if in her technical work that she's had agencies that have been able to self-fund.
And Jennifer, and thank you, Judge Bowles, because not everyone does not have that resource available to them. But what I'm thinking about is, are there ways that communities can engage providers, offer trainings, or other things that they can do to stopgap dangerous visitations, so to speak?
Yeah, absolutely. So what I think and tell me, Michelle, if I'm going down the wrong path. It's true for many, not every community has the Justice for Families grant, right? That gets a lot of training and technical assistance and support to understand that for families impacted by intimate partner violence, the way we provide supervised visitation has to be responsive and reflective of the reason why families are coming, right? So the abuse or harm that's been caused are the types of things that need to be paid attention to, rather than applying a child welfare or a different kind of model that isn't paying attention to the dynamics and have the understanding of domestic violence that they need to have to check, to be able to, address the nuances and the complexities and understand survivors' behavior, right? So I think, some of what you said, right? Reaching out and building coalition, engaging those supervised visitation programs into, whether it's a DV task force or bringing visitation into the larger community response to address intimate partner violence, will help address some of these issues, right? Because we often have it as an aside. We know they work with survivors. but they're not a part of our larger response, which means they're not a part of the conversations. They're not getting the same training and support and sort of deepening their understanding of what adult survivors and children need, as well as the needs and behaviors of people who use violence. And so because I'll say this is what we did in our community, right? We had a visitation program and they were awful. And I spent more of my time as an advocate advocating against the visitation program because the harm they were causing to survivors. And so what I did is I pushed them away. Whereas what I needed to do as a domestic violence program prior to opening a visitation center was to bring them in, to sort of go there, to understand how they were doing their work, to offer training and support so that if they had families who had these experiences, they were better understanding the dynamics, they were better understanding behavior, they were understanding that while we provide different types of supervised visitation, and some of what we do is going to be the same, some of what we do has to be different. Because a family who's coming because of abuse and neglect, what we're paying attention to is this person a good parent? Can they care for their child? Can they meet their child's basic needs? So that is what that visitation provider should be paying attention to. But if a family's coming because of risk of stalking, that doesn't mean a parent isn't a good parent. I mean, we can argue that in another conversation. But if we're only paying attention to whether this parent brings, healthy food and plays appropriately and is affectionate towards their child and saying, oh, things are going well, that information is irrelevant if the reason why they were referred was because this parent was stalking and caused abuse and harm to the other parent, right? So programs have to recognize that what they're paying attention to and how they're engaging with families needs to be based on why they're coming. And so for programs that aren't funded and maybe aren't centered around DV, we need to bring them in. We need to offer them training and support and see how we can create some relationships and partnerships rather than what I think happens in a lot of communities. We isolate or insulate those programs because we don't think their practice is good. And another huge piece of this, and this is connected to, it's a little bit of my soapbox, is how if visitation becomes a part of our larger community response, then we have champions for this work, right? And I'm not saying it always works, right? Because Judge Bowles, I'm hearing you, like you were a huge advocate and you continue to be, but I think there's still a disconnect where we see supervised visitation as a victim service, like we see restraining order clinics and counseling and shelters and other programs. We have to understand that this too, supervised visitation, is a victim service that is essential and has an important role in our larger response and in the work we're doing in our community to keep families safe. And so in the same ways, we would never let a restraining order clinic or a domestic violence program go under, we would all gather around and do everything we could because we know it's essential. This work has to be seen as equally essential as the other work we're doing. And I think that's one way that we can start creating the resources and the support and the buy-in for this service, for our communities, for our families, as a resource for the court, but more importantly, as a safety measure for adult survivors and children. And we have to better understand it in that way.
Thank you. Thank you for that. So we are in the midst of a pandemic. Because of the pandemic, some of the other uglier sides of life have shown itself through racial tensions, a call to acknowledge racial disparities and those kinds of things in our country. In what ways have the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, altered the way that courts and supervised visitation centers work together? And how can centers and courts be more culturally sensitive to families during this time? Also, are there innovative practices that you have seen or heard courts and supervised visitation centers implement during COVID? So it's a two-parter. One addresses COVID and how centers and courts have pivoted their services, their review hearings, those kinds of things around the pandemic. But also, how can courts and centers be more culturally sensitive to families who are entering their courtrooms and their centers?
Are you directing that toward anyone specific, Michelle?
It's out there for either
You know,
of you. I
yeah,
want you. I
let me-
would
yeah.
love to hear from both of you, if I could.
Yeah, let me just talk a little bit about the courts and the pandemic, because I think that we've all struggled as we've tried to adapt to what we thought was going to be a very short-term, short-lived problem that's turned into now almost a year of addressing. The courts here in Louisville have basically been remote since March of 2020. And you shared with the audience that although I'm retired, I have a mediation practice. I was doing all of my mediations in person at law firms, divorce and custody mediations prior to the pandemic. Quickly, we shifted to Zoom and to doing those by video. One of the things that parties have shared with me in the course of those, and some of those have domestic violence components in it, is that they actually feel more comfortable and safer in their homes doing them remote than they did in the conference rooms of the law firms, where they had to come sometimes when there were domestic violence orders or whatever. And so there's a whole different discussion about mediation and domestic violence. But for many victims, they want that option to have their case resolved because their batter's using the court system and litigation as a way to keep them engaged. But having the ability to Zoom has given them some safety, some comfort and safety, but also just the comfort of being in their own environment while they share very personal and intimate information. And so it's actually had some positive benefits that we weren't really expecting. So I don't know if the visitation centers, Jen, are you familiar? Are they using Zoom during the COVID, during the pandemic?
Yeah, so early on in the end of March, right, we recognized pretty quickly that if we were going to continue to serve families, we had to figure out how to do a larger continuum of supervised visitation services. And that, you know, for those of you who are Justice for Family funded, that was not an allowable service, but the office and everyone sort of said, we need to figure this out. We need to figure out how to do it safely. And so programs have been providing, I would say, a larger continuum of services to families, ranging from just regular check-ins, which happened early on, just like connecting with parents, making sure they had what they needed, recognizing that the more isolated or insulated, in particular, people who use violence would be feeling, the more escalated risk the survivors and kids might experience, especially if they were living in separate homes. You know, this parent wanting to see their kid and be with their child, but not being able to. And so very quickly we adapted and we connected around whether it was check-ins. We pivoted around some things that historically we wouldn't have done. You know, if it was safe and the survivor parent felt okay, we were visitation programs were exchanging a parent reading a book to their child, or a child drawing a picture and sending it to the other parent. You know, really finding the humanity and empathy in this moment, while recognizing the potential for so much risk and harm as a result of the pandemic, as a result of fear, as a result of all of the things, the higher risk that survivors may have been experiencing. Also, the great potential that they may go stay with their ex-abusive partner in this moment for all the reasons why being in one home, having someone else around to help, all of those things would make sense. And then we also started supporting people around doing remote visits. So many programs continue to do remote visits. I have programs who never went back in person yet, and there have been people who have sort of moved in and out of remote, of some like very modified version of in-person, and some who are doing some combination of both, right? Because they just can't accommodate based on the amount of time it now takes to do a visit, to sanitize, to adapt in all of the ways that centers are trying to adapt. And so there's a lot of remote visits. And it's important to say that, well, for some families, the remote visits felt safe and were a good option. But for many survivors, the idea of having created a safe place in their home where this other parent had never been, or maybe doesn't know where it is, to invite the voice or the video of that parent in for visits felt very scary, felt very triggering, and felt less safe than coming to the center. The fear of that parent being able to identify where they were because they weren't in a safe location, or they were in a confidential location, or just having created this new home where they felt safe now felt really unsafe. And so I think what's going to be really important as we hopefully move through this is that our community conversations are open and honest, and we recognize that, you know, a remote visit, a video visit doesn't necessarily make a survivor feel more safe, and that we don't blame survivors who chose not to have remote visits because they felt unsafe to go about to not have that happen for them until they could go back to the center. So I just think it's been complex and it's been difficult. And what I do know is that parents are getting more antsy now. They're getting a little bit more edgy, less, many parents were very accommodating and understanding. But there are a lot of parents now who are just like, okay, I want to see my child now. It's been a year. And in some communities, it's still not safe. I mean, as we know, in the United States, cases are still high, deaths are still high, and there are places where it just doesn't feel safe. And there's great risk to visitation providers to bring these families into their center. I can't tell you how many visitation programs have come to us and they've had to close down because their staff got COVID, or they had families who got COVID, and everyone had to go into, you know, some sort of confinement and to see whether or not they had contracted it. And so it's been really complex. And I want to say that survivor visitation programs have been, this is a shout out to them, have been extraordinary during this pandemic, and doing everything they can and bending over and backwards and twisting and trying to help maintain the connection between children and their parents, while supporting safety, while supporting the parent who's used violence from a really human, sort of empathetic place, while also recognizing the elevated risk that that was happening. And recognizing that, and I think, you know, Michelle, this piece around sort of culture and community, I think we have to understand that people are making the best choices they possibly can. And so whatever kind of contact may be happening, or survivors who went to live back with their abusive partner, or just the ways in which people have just managed to survive, is been extraordinary. And I think we as a community of folks addressing intimate partner violence are going to have to really take deep breaths and be patient and try not to judge those choices, because we all know that the floodgates, when they open and we're back in a courtroom and parents are seeking revenge and all the ugliness comes out, the ability to move to victim blaming rather than finding sort of accountability and humanity and sort of just understanding the moment will probably be great. And so I just want to speak to the need we are all going to have to just take it slow, to recognize that in these moments, people were making the best decisions they could make. It didn't mean they were safer. It didn't mean it was the safest choice, but safety was perhaps more about a roof over their head, someone to help because they had to go to work, or all of the complexities that came about as a result of this pandemic.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. So I know that we've gotten several questions in the chat about how to recognize abusive tactics, and not just in the center, but outside of the center. And I just wanted to share that I've shared in the chat that we have a training coming up. It's Envisioning Solutions for Collaborative Practice Training. It's the unique role of supervised visitation and safe exchange in the family court system. That training is March 9th, and there is a registration link. And in that training, we really speak to supervised visitation and the courts as part of a holistic response to domestic violence, custody. So if you're interested, please click that link and join the registration. Jennifer Arsenian, my colleague, has also shared a link to Inspire Action for Social Change. This is what they do. They train centers and judges on these types of topics. So please reach out. I know that you've had tons of questions that we haven't gotten to. We have time for one more question. And I just want to ask you both, what are ways, we know that courts, judges order families to supervise visitation. Sometimes families self-refer to supervised visitation. But what are safe ways to move families from visitation? What kinds of things do you need to take into consideration when a judge is thinking about moving a family from supervised visitation to maybe exchanges or non-supervised visits?
So I'm going to jump in here, Michelle. One of the things that was important to me before I made that shift was, have I given the batter or the abuser any tools to change their behavior? Have we done an assessment of what resources they need made available to them to change? There may be drug and alcohol issues, although we know that doesn't cause abuse. It can exacerbate the use of violence in a relationship. So have they had access to treatment, and have they fully addressed those issues? I am a huge proponent of batters intervention treatment or batters intervention programs, because I know that they at the core address the entitlement issues, the gender issues, the empathy and the lack of empathy, and the impact on children. And so I'm going to want to be sure that they've benefited from the programs that we have available to them. And then, you can take baby steps. You can have hours of visitation through an exchange, not necessarily an overnight, and see how that works. But I think it has to be a gradual, because what you're doing is you're building trust that that person's going to be appropriate, both with the children, and that they're not going to use that access to the children to try to access the at-risk parent. And so baby steps of hours through a supervised exchange, maybe then going to overnights if they earn that trust, and to whatever it's going to develop. But I think from the court's perspective, we also have to recognize that some parents are never going to be safe, that they're always going to use the children to get access to the other parent. And there may not be a long-term solution for those parents. Sometimes we just have to say, because of their issues with safety and the other parent and what that means to the children and the family, we have to stop visitation until they can make those changes.
Jennifer, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I do think that this is something that needs to go slow, as the judge described, and perhaps have baby steps. And I think just important to remember that what we know about supervised visitation, if no further harm is happening, it means you made the right referral, right? It doesn't mean that this parent is going to be safe outside the visit. So we just want to make sure that we know that if a parent shows ongoing harm and abuse during supervised visitation, we know that even in a monitored setting, they're no longer safe. We know if no further harm is coming and they're in supervised visits, we know that that service is the right service. The referral was the right one and is helping to support the safety of this family. And that we need to figure out how to have contact with families in an ongoing way to see if these incremental steps, if we're going to move from supervised visits to exchanges, that there's a way for that family to have to come back and report how things are going, to hear from that survivor about whether safety is continuing to continue or if there has been now new risks because the visits have been unsupervised. And so, and being willing to go back to a more restricted type of visitation if the parent who's using violence proves to be unable to continue to be safe with that child and the adult survivor at the same time.
Thank you. So thank you all for taking some time from your lunch or break to spend with us. That is all the time we have. We could talk about this topic for hours and hours on end. I'd like to thank you for your time and attention. And I'd like to thank Jennifer Rose and Judge Bowles for taking time out of their day to have a conversation with me around supervised visitation and exchange in courts. This information will be available at some point. I'm going to ask Jennifer to share when that might be available. Jennifer Arsenian, my colleague, to share when it might be available. Your questions that we did not get to, we will respond via email. Thank you again. I really appreciate you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Yes, we will
Thank you.
have the recording and more information available, and just give us about 2 weeks and it'll be on our website. So thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Please take good care. Bye.